He took her in when she had nothing, gave her son a home, and dreamed of building the family he'd always wanted. But one night, a quiet betrayal shattered everything, forcing him to question if the love they shared was ever real or just a carefully hidden lie. For the past several years, my life had settled into a predictable rhythm. I spent my days at the hospital, moving from one patient to the next, immersed in my work as a physician. My evenings were quiet, usually filled with paperwork or the hum of an old radio playing classical music in my otherwise silent home. Social gatherings had become rare, relationships even rarer. It wasn't that I didn't value companionship, I simply never made time for it. The years blurred together, steady and unremarkable, until the storm came. The hurricane hit with a fury no one in our small coastal town could have anticipated. The rain was relentless, the winds deafening. By the time the skies cleared, our community was left in shambles. Homes were flattened, streets flooded, and the hospital was inundated with the injured and displaced. It was chaos, the kind that pulls people together in tears, lives apart all at once. It was during one of those long shifts in the ER, when exhaustion tugged at my every step, that I first saw them. A young woman and her son were sitting in one corner of the triage area. She held him close, her arms wrapped protectively around his small frame as if shielding him from a world that had already taken too much. Their clothes were soaked and muddied, their faces streaked with grime, but her eyes were steady, full of resolve despite the weariness written all over her body. I walked over to them, introduced myself, and crouched to the boy's level. "Hi there," I said gently, trying to coax a smile. "What's your name?" "Sam," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of the busy room. "And your mom?" I asked, looking up at her. "Clara," she replied. Her voice was soft but firm, and her gaze held mine as though trying to judge whether I could be trusted. "They didn't have anywhere to go," Clara explained. Their home had been swept away by the rising river, and they had no family nearby. Something about her story, or maybe the way she told it with such quiet strength, struck a chord in me. I'd seen many people come through the hospital that night, all with stories of loss and desperation, but hers stayed with me. When my shift ended hours later, I couldn't shake the image of them huddled together, two lives uprooted with nowhere to turn. I found myself walking back into the waiting area, searching for them. They were still there, Sam fast asleep in Clara's arms. "Look," I began, hesitating for a moment. "I have a spare room at my place. It's not much, but it's warm, dry, and safe. You're welcome to stay until you figure things out." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw her resolve falter, replaced by a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," I said. "But I want to." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. That night, they followed me home. My house, always so still and empty, came alive in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Clara thanked me over and over as I showed them the guest room, and Sam, though shy at first, soon began asking me questions about everything from the photos on the wall to the books on my shelves. In the days that followed, the changes in my home were small but meaningful. Clara insisted on cooking dinner, apologizing that it wasn't much but making meals that somehow felt like feasts. She cleaned and tidied without being asked, turning my simple, sterile home into a place that felt warm and lived in. And then there was Sam. He was a bright, curious boy who followed me around, peppering me with questions about my work and my life. He found an old stethoscope in my study one evening and spent hours pretending to be a doctor, diagnosing imaginary patients. It made me laugh, something I hadn't done nearly enough in recent years. For the first time in a long while, I started looking forward to coming home. The house no longer felt like a shell I inhabited but a place where life thrived. Watching Clara and Sam settle in, I felt something unfamiliar stir within me, a sense of purpose beyond the walls of the hospital, a connection I hadn't known I craved. I couldn't have known then just how much they would come to mean to me or how fragile that newfound happiness would prove to be. But in those early days, I allowed myself to hope, to believe that perhaps this unexpected twist in my life was a gift, a chance to fill the emptiness I'd long ignored. Clara and Sam settled into my home as if they had always belonged there. At first, I was cautious, unsure of how this arrangement would work. I'd always been a private person, used to the quiet predictability of living alone. But it didn't take long for their presence to feel natural, even comforting. Clara had a way of transforming the atmosphere around her. She would hum softly as she prepared breakfast, her melodies weaving through the house like sunlight on a cold morning. She never overstepped, always asking if it was okay to move a vase or rearrange a cupboard, but her touch was unmistakable. The spare room, which had been little more than storage, became a cozy haven under her care. She even mended a tear in the curtains I hadn't noticed, her stitches so precise you'd think the fabric had never been damaged. Sam, on the other hand, brought energy into every room he entered. His boundless curiosity seemed to know no limits, and I found myself answering questions I hadn't considered in years. "Why do doctors wear white coats?" he asked one evening as we sat on the porch. "And why are their shoes always so quiet?" He quickly made the garden his kingdom. A small patch of untamed earth in the backyard became his battlefield, his construction site, and his research lab, all rolled into one. I bought him a small spade and some seeds on a whim, and his delight was infectious. Within days, he had a row of carefully planted flowers, each labeled with a hand-drawn sign. "This one's for you," he said, pointing to a marigold. "Because you're helping us." I found myself drawn into their lives more deeply than I had anticipated. I started coming home earlier, making excuses to leave the hospital before sunset. Dinner became a shared ritual, with Clara insisting that I take a break while she cooked. Her meals were simple but flavorful, each dish a testament to her effort and gratitude. I began to tell her stories about my work, nothing too heavy, just small victories and amusing moments, and she listened with genuine interest, her warm smile encouraging me to share more than I ever had with anyone before. One rainy afternoon, as the three of us sat by the fireplace playing a board game Sam had found in the attic, I caught myself watching them. Clara's laughter filled the room as Sam tried to bend the rules in his favor, her joy unguarded and contagious. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I had spent so much of my life focused on achievements and accolades, thinking they would fill the void I never fully acknowledged. But here, in the presence of this resilient woman and her spirited son, I felt something I hadn't expected: contentment. It wasn't long before my neighbors started noticing the changes in my routine. "Doctor, I didn't know you had a family," Mrs. Chen, who lived next door, remarked one evening as she spotted Sam running through the yard. I hesitated, unsure how to respond, and she added, "They suit you." The truth was, I had started to see them as more than guests. Sam's laughter echoed in the house like it had always belonged there, and Clara's thoughtful gestures, folded laundry, fresh flowers on the dining table, made my once empty home feel alive. It was as if they had stepped into the hollow spaces of my life and filled them with light. I started to imagine a future with them, a life where Clara's laughter wasn't fleeting and Sam's presence wasn't temporary. It felt too soon to voice these thoughts, even to myself, but they lingered, hopeful and insistent. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel a sense of purpose beyond my work. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream of what might be, never imagining how fragile those dreams could be. By the time 2 months had passed, Clara and Sam had become integral parts of my life. Our home felt like a sanctuary, a place of warmth and connection I had never realized I was missing. Every corner bore signs of their presence, from Sam's half-finished drawings on the fridge to Clara's hand-woven throw blankets draped over the couch. The three of us had settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and Clara's quiet humming as she packed Sam's school lunch. I'd drop him off at the elementary school on my way to the hospital, and every evening, Clara would greet me at the door with a soft smile and a question about my day. Sam's energy made the evenings lively. He'd drag me into games or proudly show me the latest addition to his little garden. One evening, after dinner, Clara sat across from me at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Sam had already gone to bed, and the house was unusually quiet. She spoke about her life before the hurricane, about the small, cozy home she had shared with Sam and her late husband, who had passed away 3 years earlier. "Sam doesn't remember much about him," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I try to keep his memory alive. It's important that Sam knows he was loved." The vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep within me. "You've done an incredible job with him," I said after a moment. "He's a wonderful kid, Clara. That's a reflection of you." She smiled, a mixture of gratitude and sadness in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying our conversation in my mind. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it might mean to truly share my life with them, not just as temporary guests, but as a family. Sam, too, had begun to see me as more than a landlord or a passing presence in his life. One evening, as I helped him with his homework, he asked me out of the blue, "Are you going to stay with us forever?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you ask that, buddy?" I said, trying to keep my voice even. He shrugged, his small hands gripping a pencil. "I don't know. I just like it when you're here. It feels good." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "I like being here too, Sam." Those words stayed with me long after he went to bed. I had always thought of myself as someone who wasn't meant for a family, too busy, too focused on work. But Clara and Sam had changed that. I began to imagine a future where we weren't just living under the same roof but truly building a life together. The idea didn't feel strange or sudden, it felt natural. I could see myself teaching Sam how to ride a bike, attending his school plays, and sitting with Clara on the porch as we watched the sunset. The thought was intoxicating, and I began to hope for it with a quiet fervor I hadn't felt in years. One weekend, I took them to the beach, a place Sam had been asking to visit since the hurricane had taken their old home by the water. Watching them laugh and play in the surf filled me with an unexplainable joy. I took a photo of them that day, Sam's arms flung wide as Clara knelt beside him, both of them beaming at the camera. I printed the photo and placed it on the mantel in the living room. For me, it wasn't just a picture, it was a symbol of the family I was starting to believe could be mine. Yet even as I allowed myself to dream, a small voice in the back of my mind warned me to be careful. It whispered of fragility, of how quickly things could change. But I ignored it, letting hope take root in its place. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was truly living. By the time Clara and I officially started dating, life felt like it had fallen into place. Our days were filled with laughter and shared routines, and the once temporary nature of our arrangement had transformed into something more permanent. Sam had started calling me Dad, a milestone that filled me with quiet pride. Clara and I didn't talk much about labels, but her hand in mine during our walks and the gentle kisses we exchanged when no one was looking spoke volumes. I allowed myself to dream freely, of holidays together, of Sam's milestones, of a future where we were a real family. Yet, even as those dreams took shape, something began to feel off. It started with little things. Clara seemed more distracted lately, her gaze lingering somewhere distant when she thought I wasn't looking. Sometimes, when we talked about the future, plans for Sam's schooling, renovations to the house, she would smile but say little. At first, I chalked it up to her cautious nature. She had been through so much, perhaps she needed more time to fully trust the life we were building. One evening, after Sam had gone to bed, Clara sat beside me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. We were watching a movie, but I could tell her thoughts were elsewhere. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice gentle but probing. She hesitated, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my sleeve. "No, not really," she said, forcing a smile. "It's just a lot to take in, I guess. This new life." I wanted to believe her, to take her words at face value. But something in her tone didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the first time she'd brushed off my concern, and it left me with a gnawing feeling I couldn't shake. A week later, I came home earlier than planned. Clara hadn't expected me until late, as I'd mentioned a staff meeting at the hospital. When I walked through the door, I heard her voice in the living room. She was on the phone, speaking in low, hurried tones. "I told you, I'm handling it," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "Just, don't push me. I need more time." I froze in the hallway, torn between stepping into the room and giving her privacy. Before I could decide, she must have sensed my presence, because she abruptly ended the call. "Oh, you're home early," she said, standing up quickly and smoothing her hands down her dress. Her smile was forced, her eyes searching mine. "Who was that?" I asked casually, though my heart was pounding. "Just an old friend," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Nothing important." Her answer felt rehearsed, but I didn't push. Instead, I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, though doubt crept in like a shadow. Over the next few days, the feeling of unease grew. Clara continued to act like everything was fine, but the distance between us became harder to ignore. I tried to reassure myself she had been through so much loss, so much upheaval. Maybe she just needed time to trust that this life we were building together was real and lasting. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that something was slipping through my fingers, just out of reach. It felt as though a door I hadn't known existed was beginning to creak open, revealing a part of Clara's life that she hadn't let me see. I told myself I was overthinking, but a small voice in the back of my mind refused to be silenced. It whispered warnings I didn't want to hear, casting a shadow over the future I had so desperately wanted to believe in. For the first time since Clara and Sam had come into my life, I began to wonder if my dream of family was more fragile than I'd ever realized. It was a quiet Friday night, the kind we'd come to cherish. The rain pattered softly against the windows, and the warm glow of a single lamp filled the living room with a golden hue. Clara and I sat on the couch, her legs draped over mine as we talked in soft murmurs about nothing in particular. Sam had gone to bed hours earlier, and the stillness of the house made it feel like the world existed only for the two of us. Her hand rested on my chest, her fingers tracing lazy circles that sent a subtle warmth through me. I leaned down, brushing my lips against her temple, and she tilted her face toward me, her breath soft and inviting. Our moments together were never hurried, always lingering in a way that made time feel irrelevant. I kissed her cheek, then the corner of her mouth, before finally pressing my lips to hers. There was a gentleness to the way she responded, the kind of connection that spoke more through touch than words. Her hand moved to the back of my neck, her fingers tangling in my hair as she pulled me closer. Clara had a way of making every gesture feel intimate, as though she was pouring her heart into every caress, every whispered sigh. My hand slid down her arm, resting on her waist as I drew her closer. She melted into me, her warmth against my chest making me forget everything else. But as we held each other, something flickered in her eyes when she pulled back to look at me. It was fleeting, a shadow of hesitation that disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. Still, it left me cold. I didn't say anything, choosing instead to brush a strand of hair from her face. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my hand still resting against her cheek. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, but I felt the distance in her tone. She leaned in and kissed me again, perhaps to silence any further questions. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me couldn't ignore the tension that lingered beneath the surface of her touch. It was subtle, a quiet hesitance where there had once been certainty. The truth began to reveal itself a few nights later. I had returned home earlier than expected from an evening meeting, the flicker of excitement to see her propelling me through the rain-soaked streets. But when I stepped into the house, something was off. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that made your pulse quicken without understanding why. Clara's coat wasn't by the door. At first, I thought she'd stepped out for something, but then I noticed a second pair of shoes, large and unfamiliar, half-tucked beneath the couch. I walked toward the kitchen, each step heavy with the weight of suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. As I reached the doorway, I saw them. Clara stood close to a man I didn't recognize, her hands resting lightly on his chest. They were laughing softly, their heads bent together as though sharing a private world. For a moment, I froze, the scene before me splintering the image of the life I thought we were building. I didn't make a sound, didn't move. Clara hadn't noticed me yet, too caught up in whatever intimacy they were sharing. The man leaned closer, brushing her hair back, and her eyes closed for the briefest moment. It was a touch I knew well, one that I had thought was meant only for me. My chest tightened, a quiet ache spreading as I stepped back silently, retreating before they could notice my presence. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Clara returned to the living room not long after, alone now, her smile warm and welcoming as she kissed my cheek and asked about my day. I pretended not to notice the faint flush on her cheeks, the way her movements seemed deliberately casual, as though hiding something she wasn't ready to admit. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face what it would mean, wasn't ready to hear the words that would shatter the fragile hope I had built around her and Sam. But the image of her with that man lingered, carving itself into my thoughts with cruel precision. That night, as she lay beside me, Her hand resting lightly on my chest as she drifted to sleep, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a storm of questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on me, but I stayed silent, unsure if I could bear to hear the truth. The days that followed were a strange blur of pretense and quiet observation. I didn't tell Clara I had seen her with the man. Instead, I watched, waiting for cracks to appear in the surface of the life we had built. It felt cruel, but I needed to know if my suspicions were real, if the intimacy I thought we shared was now a facade. Clara, for her part, seemed unchanged. She still kissed me in the mornings before I left for work, still laughed at Sam's jokes during dinner. But every so often, I'd catch her glancing at her phone with a flicker of unease, or hear her voice drop when she took calls in the other room. Each moment piled onto the quiet storm building inside me. One evening, I decided to test the waters. Over dinner, I mentioned an upcoming medical conference in another city, one that would keep me away for a few days. Her reaction was subtle but telling. "That's great," she said with a too bright smile, her eyes darting briefly toward Sam. "It'll be a good opportunity for you." Her words were supportive, but her tone held something I couldn't quite place. Relief? Anticipation? I couldn't be sure, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. The night before I was supposed to leave, I made my move. Instead of heading to the airport, I stayed in a small motel on the edge of town, waiting. It felt wrong, like an invasion of her privacy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know. By the time I returned home late that evening, the house was dark. For a moment, I thought I had been wrong, that I had let my fears cloud my judgment. But as I stepped into the living room, the faint scent of cologne, one I didn't recognize, lingered in the air. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing against me like a heavy weight. I could feel the puzzle pieces falling into place, but the picture they formed was incomplete, fragmented. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside her, Clara stirred in her sleep. She murmured something, a name I didn't recognize. I froze, listening as her breathing evened out again. The name was meaningless to me, but the way it escaped her lips, soft, familiar, laced with emotion, sent a chill down my spine. It was as though I had been handed a piece of a riddle, one I couldn't yet solve. In the days that followed, I began to notice other strange details. A receipt tucked into the corner of her purse, dated for a night I thought she had been home. A scarf left on the coat rack that didn't belong to her or Sam. They were small things, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I considered confronting her, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of losing her, of unraveling the life I had so desperately wanted to believe in. Or maybe it was something else, a need to understand the full picture before I made my move. One afternoon, while she was out running errands, I found myself standing in the living room, staring at the photograph on the mantel. The one I had taken of her and Sam at the beach, both of them laughing, their faces glowing with joy. For the first time, the image felt distant, like it belonged to a life that wasn't mine anymore. I picked it up, running my thumb along the edge of the frame, and that's when I noticed it, a faint crease in the corner, as though the photo had been removed and replaced. I opened the back of the frame, my heart pounding. Beneath the picture, folded neatly, was a note. The handwriting was unmistakably Clara's, but the words made my chest tighten. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. I hope you'll understand someday." The note ended there, cryptic and unresolved, leaving more questions than answers. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the weight of her secrets pressing against me like a tidal wave. Whatever Clara was hiding, it was bigger than I had imagined. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The day Sam's adoption papers arrived, the house was filled with his laughter. He ran through the living room, waving the documents like a victory flag, his face beaming with joy. "You're my dad now," he shouted, his voice bursting with excitement. I crouched down, catching him in a hug, my chest tight with emotion. "I've always been your dad, Sam," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This just makes it official." Clara wasn't home when the papers came. She'd been gone more often lately, offering excuses that I accepted without question, though each one left an echo of doubt. But when she returned that evening, Sam ran to her, his joy overflowing as he shared the news. She knelt to his level, wrapping him in her arms, her smile warm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, she said, kissing his forehead. That night, after Sam had gone to bed, Clara and I sat together on the porch. The air was still, the kind of silence that carried weight. She held a mug of tea, staring into the dark yard as though searching for something she couldn't find. Sam's happy, I said, breaking the quiet. He is, she agreed, her voice soft. I turned to her, watching her profile in the dim light. Are you? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a long sip of her tea before setting the mug down and turning to face me. I don't know, she admitted, her voice steady but distant. The honesty in her words was disarming. It was something I had sensed for a while now, that she was searching for something I couldn't provide. Do you regret this? I asked. No, she said quickly, her gaze meeting mine. Never. You and Sam, you've been everything I needed. But I think, her voice trailed off, and she shook her head as if trying to find the right words. You think it's time for something else, I finished for her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. You've given Sam a home, a future. And you've given me so much. But I've been holding on to this idea of who I'm supposed to be, and I don't think I even know who I am anymore. It wasn't a shock, but hearing her say it out loud still hurt. I had wanted so badly for this life we'd built to work, for the dream to become a reality. But I couldn't ignore the truth in her words. What do you want to do? I asked, keeping my voice steady. She took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I think I need to go. Not forever, she added quickly, but for a while. I need to figure out who I am outside of all this. And Sam? Her face crumpled slightly, but she steadied herself. Sam's where he belongs. With you. You're his father in every way that matters. The next morning, Clara packed her things. Sam watched with wide eyes, his small face a mixture of confusion and sadness. She knelt in front of him, holding his hands as she explained as gently as she could. I love you more than anything, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I'll always be here for you. But I need some time to figure things out, okay? Are you coming back? He asked, his voice trembling. She smiled, brushing his hair back. I'll always be part of your life, Sam. I promise. Her words seemed to soothe him, and he hugged her tightly. I stood by the door, my own emotions a tangled knot as I watched them say goodbye. When she finally turned to me, her expression was a mixture of gratitude and regret. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For what? I asked. For giving us a home. For giving Sam what I couldn't. I didn't have the words to respond, so I nodded. She left quietly, her car disappearing down the driveway as Sam and I stood on the porch. He slipped his hand into mine, and I squeezed it gently. Are you okay, buddy? I asked. He nodded after a moment, looking up at me with a small smile. We'll be okay, right? Yeah, I said, pulling him close. We'll be okay. That evening, we had dinner together, just the two of us. Sam told me about school, about the kite he wanted to fly over the weekend, and about a drawing he'd started for me. His energy was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel heavy with uncertainty. After he went to bed, I lingered in the living room, my gaze drifting to the photograph on the mantel, the one of Clara and Sam at the beach. It still held a place in our home, a reminder of what had been and what had brought us to this moment. But my focus shifted to Sam's latest drawing pinned to the fridge, a crude but joyful sketch of the two of us holding hands, smiling under a bright sun. For Clara, the journey ahead was one of discovery, a bittersweet departure from a life she had helped create. For me, it was the beginning of something new, something full of hope and the kind of happiness that came from knowing I could give Sam the love and stability he deserved. The past would always be part of us, but it no longer defined us. Together, Sam and I had found our way forward, and that was more than enough. Would you forgive someone who betrayed you after you gave them everything they needed to rebuild their life? Write in the comments.